day. This is Doris Viljoen, Senior Futurist at the IFR, and I have the privilege of talking to Sabina Lehman, one of our research associates. Hello, Sabina.
Hi, good morning, Doris.
Recently, you did a really cool analysis of 3 big speeches that happened this past week. Give us a little bit of background about the 3 speeches.
Yes, as it turns out, Ramaphosa, Boris Johnson, and Donald Trump all gave an address with regards to the COVID-19 crisis on the same day. It was on Monday, the 23rd of March. And I ended up looking at all 3 of those speeches next to each other and just having a look at the kind of images and systems and worldviews were in place. And it was most fascinating to see all 3 talks together.
You mentioned the different levels now, and that's a reference to one of the cool thinking tools that we use in future studies called the Causal Layered Analysis. I'm going to share a slide of that. There we go. Just let me find it quickly. There we go. Do you want to give us a quick run through of the thinking tool and what we do with it?
Yes, so Causal Layered Analysis is a thinking tool developed by Sohail Inayatullah, and it really has 4 levels that we look at when we try and understand a problem. These levels are not, they look hierarchical, but they actually interrelate with each other, and one level is not necessarily more important than the other level, and we often move between levels when we talk about a problem. The first level is litany level. This is the level where facts are often unquestioned. We look at very simple trends and issues. I often call it the dinner party conversation, where you think you're having a deep discussion, but in fact people are just throwing facts at each other. Doris, systems?
Yes, systems.
You?
Okay, systems level is that the deeper one, the one of the social causes and those systems that underline and sort of cook out the stuff that we see on the litany level. And then we get to the interesting ones. I'm going to leave them to you to explain.
Yes, so worldview is the next level, and this is often deeper and unconsciously held assumptions about the discourse. It often emanates from a place of culture or tradition that informs what systems we have in place and how our dinner party conversations really take place. And then, of course, my favorite is the level of images, stories, or metaphors. And these are deeply held narratives, often quite emotional, deeply held beliefs that are usually quite difficult to unearth. You've got to really listen out for them. And they often come out in the metaphors that we use or the images that we engage with when we're trying to explain a problem.
Yes. And that's also the level where if we really want change to happen, that is where we have to work, changing that narrative. Okay, please take us through your analysis of the 3 speeches. What did you find?
It was fascinating. I didn't have any expectations of what I was going to find, but it was really fascinating. So first of all, I looked at Ramaphosa's speech, which was about 25 minutes long. And was interesting to note that he spent the majority of his time at systemic level. He announced the lockdown. He gave great amount of detail as to how the system would function in lockdown and detail as to how citizens will be financially supported during this period. If I quote him, he says, "Our fundamental task at this moment is to contain the spread of the disease." When I looked at the worldview level, I noticed that the system that he was putting in place really came from a worldview of the right to life superseding economic growth. So he states that while this measure will have considerable impact on our economy, everybody's right to life is really what is driving the system. I then looked at Boris Johnson's speech. Interestingly enough, this was only 6-minute long speech, and he spent the most amount of time actually in the worldview phase. Here he stated, I just need to get to here he goes. He stated that a solution can be found, implied that it will likely be by the UK itself. And he used words such as, and I'm quoting here, "It's true that there is a clear way through. We are strengthening our amazing NHS. We are increasing our stocks of equipment. We are accelerating search for treatments. We are pioneering works for a vaccine. We are buying millions of testing." And finally, I looked at President Trump's talk. So interesting enough, he was the one that appeared with his task force behind him. The other two leaders spoke on their own. And his portion of the speech was about 15 minutes. He spent the majority of his time at litany level. And interestingly enough, even started out, his very first sentence that he said was, I see we have fewer people in the room because of the virus problem. And his litany level was very much focused on the unforeseen nature of the problem that was being taken by surprise. He used much quantitative reference to the number of masks that could be bought, the number of doctors and respirators available, and he used very short time frames referring to tomorrow or the next 24 hours or even the next week. His time frames were not very much longer than that. I found that very, very interesting.
Oh, lovely. And of course, then we get to the deepest level, those images. Were there differences in the images that the three leaders used?
Yes, again, very interesting. There were the differences. Ramaphosa ended his address with a metaphor of unity and sacrifice, not really surprising, that comes from a country with a spirit of Ubuntu. And I will quote from his address. He says, I call on all of us, one and all, to play our part, to be courageous, to be patient, and above all, to show compassion. Let us never despair. We are a nation at one, and we will surely prevail. So this, to me, was a real image of unity and calling on the spirit of Ubuntu. Prime Minister Johnson, he used the metaphor of war, and again, perhaps not surprising, considering the UK's role in the Second World War. And again, I quote from him, he said, the coronavirus is the biggest threat to this country has faced for decades. In this fight, we, every one of us, is directly enlisted. I want to thank everyone who's working to beat the virus. So very much war metaphors, war images. And then President Trump really used the metaphor about getting back to work and normality. He talked about fixing the problem and fixing the problem quickly. He says we will win it much sooner than people think we will, and we'll be back in business as a country back to pretty soon. And my emphasis, he says, let's go work. And he ends with that.
Okay, all right. I'm going to stop sharing this slide. And I want to say really thank you, Sabina. This was like a really cool analysis. It's on the one hand, a very nice description of how to put this thinking tool into practice for our fellow practitioners and for other people that are thinking of using it, but it's also on its own a really good analysis of three speeches. So thank you very much for that.
It was a pleasure. Thank you very much. Goodbye.